I would be surprised if a psychedelic visual field ends up producing the same sorts of internal experiences that the psychedelic state does.
That's exactly where the research is right now. So the general theme of it really seems to be going in this direction that there is a lot that can be done with just changing how we look at the world. And there's always this low-level synesthesia to some degree, for some people more than for others. But there is a somatic element to visual design. Like if you see spiky things, you kind of feel them. This ties also into this literature on flickering lights. And there's a lot of variation with flickering lights. Some people get seizures. Some people are like, well, this is just on and off what you want. And some people meet God. And there's everything in between. Like some people have come out of those experiences and are like, I need to integrate this for a couple of weeks. But these things have been around for a while. Like the earliest accounts of somebody apparently you can look at the sun and just wave your hand in front of you. You can produce some flickering, and then there are these lamps that spin, and people are doing this in all sorts of ways. But you can induce thalamocortical hyperconnectivity just by straight up flickering lights with nothing else. And thalamocortical hyperconnectivity is a big part of what people think about in this like top-down, bottom-up processing, brain entropy, however you want to call it.
But it sounds like people are trying to use these psychedelic experiences and recreate them in different ways because they want to understand something fundamental about the brain and how it produces this experience that we have.
Yeah, and by taking parts of it, it makes it more manageable, because these substance-based experiences, they act all over your body and they're really complex. Like you have neurons that are serotonin receptive all over your body, so it's really difficult to figure out what, like maybe those in your gut are really important. Like who the fuck knows?
Well, it's crazy. We tried to, before we even really tried psilocybin, we were trying to read a lot about how it works and the mechanism, and it's like the primary binding site was like the kidney, like the adrenal glands or something. It's just bananas. And then they're like, serotonin after that. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so it's not, because I actually studied neuroscience as an undergraduate, and it's like this very pretty story for the most part, at least back then. This was like, a couple centuries ago. But like this idea that like a chemical binds here and it activates this pathway that's well understood. And psychedelics just don't seem to check those boxes in any way.
Yeah, especially if you look at the what they're doing now with ibogaine. What they're reporting is that, okay, in addiction, we have a relatively clear idea of mechanistically, you are supposed to have like there are receptors that build up, and that's why it takes a long time to get rid of that, because your biological system has changed. But if you just take ibogaine and meet God, all of a sudden you can break that within a few days. Like how the fuck does that match with our mechanical system at all? Like it just seems like a big mismatch in story, and this really puts into question our model of addiction and substance dependency on the receptor level. Like, doesn't mean all the tools we have developed based on that mechanistic understanding are wrong or bad all of a sudden. It just means, well, there's another level of complication here, probably, that we didn't think about. And to tie it back to...
the same thing also should apply to flashing lights. Like, the idea that you can flash a light at 10 hertz and meet God seems somehow to break any frame for which I understand mystical experiences.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
So fractals.
Yes, why am I using the term fractal? Well, in this case, it's very concrete because that's how the literature talks about it. More concretely, what they say is that if you look at the patterns that occur in nature, they have this recursion element to it, right? That are like self-referential. That if you look at like some plants, that's much more obvious than in others,
like ferns or something.
Yeah, but in general, this sort of thing exists, and then people came up with this idea that hey, maybe this fractal dimension that you can measure mathematically is somehow relevant for why it feels calming to look at these things, with the idea that our fractals are a really good compression algorithm. That's what Mandelbrot developed his thing for in the first place. It was designed because he was trying to figure out, if you have satellites that are looking at coastlines, how can you compress the data about the coastlines to communicate it from the satellites back down to Earth? And that's what he developed.
I had no idea he was trying to make some sort of practical application.
No, that's what it came out of. Yeah, it was image compression. Like data compression is where the Mandelbrot fractal thing came out of, because he was definitely in hyperphantasia. Like he always did math in his mind as geometry. Like he even talks about in the when he took this mathematics exam for some like higher ed, I don't remember what exactly it was. He was like, well, he felt like he was cheating because he was reading the formula. It translated automatically into geometry in his mind. He solved it geometrically, and then he translated the result back into on paper. And he didn't have a way to get there. But the results were correct. So he was like, well, I don't know. It's just how it works for me, right? It's going to tie back into why I don't really think you're wrong about Wolfram later. But there's just people like that. And for him, he was that tall of thinker. And fractals are really good at compressing data because it has a self-recursion element, right? And that's when this idea of, hey, there are these fractal patterns that are really useful if we want to take pictures of nature and compress them down a lot, right? And then people...
And perhaps nature is doing this as well, right? Because the simplest way to encode information about your structure of your future progeny would be the simplest set of rules possible. Like this protein stacks in this way, we keep doing this process, iterating on it, and we do the same thing. And
Is there a difference between just fractal and periodic of some degree? Because I'm thinking about certain types of proteins that are widespread, and they're repeated sets of like a small unit cell that just gets made over and over again, like collagen or something like that, which is just, I think, two proteins, small ones, arranged in a helical structure. Is that fractal, or is that just some kind of...
It might just be another mode of conserving blueprints.
Yeah, I am not the right person to talk about the details of fractals. The part of it that I understand is that people came up with this idea that, okay, you have these, like, fractals are a really interesting way to compress data from nature. And our system has to find ways to efficiently deal with the information that it's perceiving, right? So maybe the fractal dimension of what you're looking at, which is essentially how much of a perfect fractal is the thing, right? That's what the fractal dimension is. So it can be a perfect mathematical fractal that you generate on a computer. Then you have like a Koch curve or like something like that. Or it can be more like noisy, more like statistical. It's kind of a fractal, right? And turns out the most like prevalent fractal dimension, at least visually in nature, is like 1.7 roughly, that they measure somehow mathematically. And then they came up with this idea that, well, our system they're trying to more or less evolutionary. We're like trying to deal and compress data from nature as efficiently as possible. So maybe if you show input to someone that has the same fractal dimension as the stuff that we are used to perceiving through evolution, then that's very easy to process, and that's why it's restorative for you, because you're like, it's just, I know what to do with this. There's not a bunch of right angles and like weird things. Like it's the self-referential stuff is essentially really nicely processable by our biology, that you find these fractal structures if you look at the whole processing stack of how the input actually gets processed first in the retina and then the brain, whatever, that you find these fractal structures everywhere. That just makes it so that it's very easy. The input is very easy for us to digest. That's what it boils down to. And that might also be why if you increase the projection onto the world through a psychedelic or something like that you end up seeing fractals everywhere, because you're essentially mapping the structure of your processing system more onto the world. It's more projective, right? Because your system is designed to process in a fractal way, to compress data really nicely, to process things efficiently. If you boost up the projection element, you'll end up seeing fractals everywhere, more or less.
It's really interesting because when you go into the woods, there's so many different textures and layers and surfaces that I think that experience is in part what's so soothing. Because I think in some ways when you're in these old European cities and there's these magnificent cathedrals, there's something about the ornateness of an old building that is more soothing than something that's some like brutalist concrete monstrosity that's faced in basically like square grid blocks. And on psychedelics, you're exactly right. You look at something that's flat white and all of a sudden it has all of this texture on it. And the texture is in some ways soothing to look at by virtue of the fact that it masks the lack of aesthetics and the lack of design in the world around us.
But most people aren't doing psychedelics to soothe themselves.
You don't think so?
I don't know. What do you think? Like, can we like circle back on this like meta question of what is the value of psychedelics in the world?
Sure. I wanted to take this to the visuals, and we were coming from the academics. That's where I was going. Well, we can go into that. So, why people take psychedelics, and it's this. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why they do it. There's sociological reasons. They're doing it to impress people.
Well, let's be personal about it. Like, why would you do it?
I wouldn't anymore. I've left the chapters behind me. Unless you can you can of course speculate about endogenous psychedelics, like is our brain releasing DMT from the pineal gland or whatever. Which there's very little. This rat study evidence. We've talked about that before. That's about all we know. But whatever. No, that's for me personally. But I have in the past. It was mostly curiosity. Mostly I like. The thing that I'm really fixated on is how the fuck does all of this work? Like, how can I even be here and interact with the world? Like, it's yeah. That's a fundamental question that, like, for me, when I was like 18 or something, that really kind of struck me when I was trying to figure out, like, okay, is dealing with all this basic philosophical question, like Descartes' demon and the whole shebang of like, okay, how. Like, is there any explanation that tells me that it's not just me or why anything is happening at all? Like, why should there be something happening? Like, what the hell is going on here? And it sort of requires that there is a separation between at least two things. But why would there be a separation, and how can one experience the other? Like this whole mystery of existing or like perceiving, and psychedelics were an interesting, like in part it was an interesting cultural phenomenon, but it was also like a really interesting way to dive into like messing with your experience and also what sort of things you have control over. Like, because psychedelics, one of the things they do is that they show you that what you thought is just constant in the world, it's just how the world is actually a lot of what this whole thing about the perception box, or that's one way of thinking about it. There's whole different ways of thinking about it.
But it's a narrow view of what all is happening behind the scenes.
Exactly. Like, I think the natural way we are at least brought up, is that you expect that most of, like, maybe there's like, okay, I perceive things a little different, but for the most part, it's like this is stable and I am me and this is the world and that's how it works. And you're like, sort of, you assume there's a certain stability to the whole thing. And psychedelics put the whole thing into question all of a sudden. And also, like, how much of this is actually me instead of the world? And like, where's the boundary between the two and those things, and exploring that. But there's also a big risk in that. And and there's also this, because it depends on what sort of person you are. Because if you realize that you have a lot more control over what is happening, you can also blame yourself for a lot more things. You can start to get into this mode of like, well, something's not going right, it's my fault. And you can really go into bad recursive loops. Like Jung actually had it's a comment that Jung made in a letter to, I don't remember who was suggesting he would take psychedelics. And he was like, well, I already have enough on my plate. I don't feel like if I open myself up more that I would actually be able to deal with the additional stuff that comes up. Like, I understand there's more to be known, but like, I'm already like, I'm trying to stay within the zone of proximal development, as Peterson would say, right? You know, like, sometimes there's a good reason to be like, okay, I want to know more, and sometimes you should be like, well, clean up your room first, and so that's what it was for me, But that's with the classics. It's like for LSD especially, is something that really resonated with me because it's more this like engineering mechanical thing to it. Cannabis is very different in the way that LSD really sort of, it seems to provide you an answer, and it comes with this meaning injection that in the beginning I thought was, whoa, this really lets you discover the meaning. And then the more I was in the psytrance, in the scene of people doing this, I was like, well, this also seems kind of random what it assigns meaning to. Like, it really can assign meaning to basically anything.
Did you see people assigning meaning to things that didn't seem that meaningful to you? Or what do you mean by the fact that it could be anything?
The main thing that you keep running into is people that are like, well, it's all a loop. And like everything is one. And I'm like, well, sure, what now? Like, great, but like, what do you do with that? And it seemed like really people who were sort of incapacitated by the idea of a loop. And I was like, well, if they're at least talking about a strange loop, which is a concept I learned later, that would be better. But like, really, it can be this, like, it can be sort of incapacitating, even though it's fully meaningful. I was like
this is my problem with theories of everything in general. That by trying to talk about everything, you end up talking about nothing, I fear.
That's the question where you start, so we can get into Wolfram. One short comment I want to make about Cannabis, though, but the difference for me that I've had with Cannabis, I feel like Cannabis asks more questions than it has answers, and it's more explorative in that sense, because it tends to go in these waves a little more. It depends on the dosage and how you react to it. And all of these substances, it needs to be, people should always be careful and start with low dose and whatever. But the general theme for me with Cannabis seems to be that it makes you excited about something. And then that also drops off again, and you start to question it, and then you get excited again, and then it questions it again. And if you have too high of a dose, that loop is so quick that it's just anxiety, because everything is all of a sudden like, oh, and you have these bodily sensations that can be really uncomfortable, and it's just overwhelming anxiety. But if you have the right sort of dosage, you get these periods where you're like, oh, this is super fascinating, and whether it's visual or an idea or whatever. But then you also drop out of it and you start to question it, thinking, like, what was I even thinking? My memory isn't working correctly, and it weaves you in and out, which can be used as a tool to like really get this. There's this thing about being on the threshold between chaos and order, if you want to talk about it in these mythopoetic terms, right? But this idea that you always need to go, you want to go into something new and discover something and pull it out of the ether or whatever. And then you want to have a period where you really take what you got and do something with it. And then there's this communication back and forth between the two, right? Which you have at different time scales. You can talk about boom and bust cycles in academia. Right now, it's a lot of like, you take a little thing, and once it's useful, you like run with it forever. And they're really hard, and like, the updating loop is not really good anymore. You can also go into the opposite direction, where you're just stuck in the mysticism and the ether, where it's constantly just inspiration and you never take the time to try and integrate it with the world. Or you can have people that are just like McKenna and others in the 70s. There was a lot of this self-programming culture where they were like constantly, they were never sure where they are. They're like oscillating between the extremes quite a bit. And that's why I'm more comfortable. I'm most comfortable at this like understanding the process of weaving in and out of chaos and order, because there's like a rhythm. There's like it's a little bit like a pump. At the end of the day, it's a little bit similar to a cell that is constantly pumping energy in and out, right? You have stuff that is you and stuff on the outside, and you're constantly moving things in and out.
And if you make the membranes more permeable, all of a sudden you can have this huge flux of ideas into you, right? And so the idea, I've come across Robin Carhart Harris's thing about the danger of having improperly assigned meaning in the aftermath of psychedelic experiences. Like, I think he wrote a paper about the fact that there's this false profundity that often comes from a psychedelic experience.
Who calls it false, though?
Well, yeah, this is one of my earliest experiences. Like, the first time I ever had a psychedelic experience, I was just plagued by the fact that I wouldn't be able to remember, like, bring it back home with me. And I was just, like, writing and, like, just trying really hard to hold on to it. And then, of course, as it fades, like, it becomes inaccessible in some sense. And well, I think one of the most obvious versions of this is salvia.
Oh, yeah, crazy.
Right? Because you're flown to another universe, but you can't bring any of it back with you. And I remember this, and for a while after these early experiences, I kind of stopped. I just was like, this is kind of stupid, because, like, what can I do with this, you know? And I've found more use in it now that I've discovered the woods pairing. And it's more of a cleansing thing for me now, where I'll have all this stress from the week. Usually go to the woods once a week, low dose psilocybin, and just sort of get the priorities aligned again. And so I feel like, as you know, for Jung, you mentioned Jung being afraid to let too much in. I feel like by letting
Hume.
Oh, it's Hume.
No, Hume. No, call C.J. Hume.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought it was Hume. Sorry, that's my bad. In my bed.
So as opposed to, I do think that there's like this roller coaster phase where it does feel like you're letting too much in, but I think because the cup can only hold so much, you actually kind of like everything spills over and sort of realigns you towards your intentions in the universe, perhaps what you're trying to do. And you take away from it, like you've cleaned off all of the little details and you're just oriented towards being a person that can handle the main objective more. That's my experience.
It's like taking the barnacles off of a ship.
Yeah, just sort of. Yeah.
But I feel like this is where we can get into like the ego development aspect of this, because I think you need to really have developed integration strategies for yourself in order to really be able to deal with that properly, because it can go all sorts of ways. There's also people who get like addicted to the download, like because you can really get this like meaning feeling that is so visceral and so mystic and important that they just keep going back to it, right? And like and I think you really just need to have a properly developed, like whether you call it ego or personality, is a tricky terms to talk about. But that also goes back to the question of how much are we one sense of self and how much are we like more of a social thing, right? We have had these discussions with Ogi and Andres especially about considering the mind or the personality as more like a social
a network
of like individual agents, and then you can go into like 11 and all the way down and whatever, but like really it seems to be what people can keep coming back to is that at least your different senses need to be integrated and communicate with each other, and you have working memory slots and things like that, and people always keep bouncing around this idea that you have different aspects to yourself that can also take hold of you, right? And if you look at Jordan Peterson's framing of that, he is thinking about that as like, okay, these are like mostly like emotion based and like things that can really take a hold of you. If you get really angry, that's something where you really can kind of turn into a different person, and that you need to. That for him, there's a mix between socializing on the outside and socializing on the inside. That for your development to properly happen, you need to both be able to deal with different sorts of people in social environments, but also on your inside, you need to manage all these like fighting. You can really consider them sub-agents or individual personalities. He even draws the line to like, of course, when you had the polytheistic religions, then it's considered that you have all these individual gods for different purposes. You have a god of rage and a god of lust and whatever. And as people developed more and more of a meta-ego, then they went to monotheistic religions, and that there's sort of this. That's why we started to become just better at integrating individual parts, and then you can. If you want to start like where does consciousness come from, you had these people on talking about, okay, at the start you're fully controlled by every urge, you're like more in the animalistic mindset, right? Like everything takes a hold of you completely, and then you come to this realization, if it's snake poison or whatever it is, where you feel like, okay, I don't have to, I have some control, like I can recognize it, but I can develop this like meta personality. And those stack. It seems to be that those stack, and you need to have at least come to the point where you have properly integrated, however exactly you measure that, this subculture within you. Otherwise, psychedelics are really unpredictable. They can really, it's really hard. They're still somewhat unpredictable.
And maybe that's why I walked away from it when I was younger, in all honesty. Like, I was just not developed enough to, and secure in my own sense of place in the universe or something like this. I've heard Peterson mention also that psychedelics, he framed it like this: psychedelics are experience without preconception about the experience. Like, it's sort of perception without a memory of how the perception should unfold.
Well, and then, I mean, we're talking about psychedelics. It's like there's a lot of things people consider psychedelics. Like, that sounds like a 5-MeO DMT, at least the way Andreas describes it, this idea of like sensation where things like sort of stop being, well, they don't stop being integrated. The way he thinks about it is like everything gets into synchrony, and therefore there's not this observer object thing happening anymore because everything becomes one and whatever. It sounds more like that sort of thing.
No, I just thought it was an interesting, I can see it. I can see what he is pointing at. I'm not sure it's the best way of putting it, but I mean, I think this is even why cannabis is appealing to me when I'm working on something creative. Like if I'm writing something creative, trying to explore some space, right? Because when I sit down at the piano, pick up a guitar, I'm not necessarily attached to preconceived ideas about what I should be making the guitar do. I more just have this exploratory mindset. Like I'm experiencing the notes almost for the first time in some sense. Of course, it's mapped onto my experience. Like I know where to put my hands to some extent, but it does have this novelty to it, which can be quite instrumental. I mean, if we're looking for reasons why psychedelics could be useful to humanity.
But I would say this is more of a, that goes back to more what I described earlier about cannabis, about more being like this weaving thing, because with, for example, like LSD, you can also use them to be like hardcore in one direction and project onto the world in a very specific. Like there's Nazi hate groups that like using LSD, right? Just because.
Say more about that.
Yeah, that's wild. What?
Can you say it in German? No, I'm just kidding.
The Germans just cannot catch a break.
Yeah. No, because that's like it was Shulgin or Groff, I think it was Shulgin, who called like psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers for the most part, right? Like nothing in them is inherently good. It's they really can. That's why you have this whole MK Ultra nature and this whole thing. Like there was this whole research by the CIA for a long time where they were trying to figure out can they use it to directly program people, right? And part of why that kind of works, they got that from the concentration camps, from the Nazis. They got the LSD originally from the Nazis were doing experiments in the concentration camps, trying to use it as a truth serum. And when the US came in and scooped up all the information.
What's worse than being in a concentration camp? Being in a concentration camp on acid.
Well,
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So that's where the CIA line of research came from. They when they scooped up all the stuff in Germany, they found that research that they were doing in concentration camps on trying to use it as a truth serum. And that's where they got the initial supply and the initial research and stuff to then get going into this mind manipulation phase, right? Where you can use these substances to sort of deprogram yourself, but they can also be used to program you, especially in combination with hypnosis and other things. And that. Yeah.
But I thought that those programs didn't really work.
Well, they're not reliable.
Nice.
It's not easy to they definitely can point you, it can get you locked into a certain direction. It's just not easy to understand how to get you locked into the direction that they want you to go.
Well, these hate groups are actually able to use them for programming people to hate more? What are they using them for?
It's more about the projection element. That's what I was talking about earlier, that there's this constructive element to perception. And whenever you have a substance that allows you to be more open to the world, usually you also have the ability to project more onto the world, right? That's where there's a sort of natural element to this, that people with certain types of hyperphantasia and things like that are in general have more control over what they perceive in the world. And that can be sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, where they don't realize that it's more malleable the way they perceive the world, right? And you're sort of with this higher brain entropy and this bottom up, top down mixing, it can go either way. And it's probably mostly a attention strategy whether you use those states to be more perceptive to your environment, or whether you're using them to be more project your vision of what you want to see out there, and then you see everything this is how these are dirty people and this is how it has to be.
It's strange to me though, because from my experience with psychedelics, it's they're integrating as opposed to substances that are capable of producing super strong negative emotions. And so it seems like they would make it much more difficult to maintain some kind of
cohesive,
intentional separation between you and someone else. And so it's amazing that it's actually even capable of doing that, because for me, the psychedelic experience is one of oneness. We are all one loop till everything comes together, and so it's very, very strange.
But a lot of new initiates will have this experience of dissolution as well, and I think that if you want to rewire if you want to make use of somebody's consciousness in the most insidious way, perhaps breaking them down to the fundamental chaos is a good place to start.
Yeah, that's exactly what they do. They you look into the history of mind manipulation, it's ideally.
Yeah.
You starve them, you break them down physically and mentally, and then that's when you can program them.
Is there a German verb for that?
For what exactly?
Breaking someone down to their elemental psychic components. Sorry.
Not that
I'm sorry.
nothing comes to mind.
The Germans are lovely people.
Maybe it's not in the zeitgeist anymore. Yeah, I would like to tie the loop back from like the visuals and the actually going into the academic thing from there, and then we can because so part of what we were talking about earlier, you mentioned that if you're on psychedelics and you look like at a white wall, it's much easier to project things onto. Actually, a lot of times it's like these. I think you call them popcorn ceiling in English, right? They are not just white. It's not flat. It has a little bit of structure, but it's a very noisy structure. And that's kind of similar to what you get if you close your eyes. It's like this very noisy thing. And that's the sort of input, that seems to be the sort of input where it's really easy for your brain to map all sorts of interpretations onto it, right? And you can have degrees of that where it's like sort of suggestive of certain things. Like you could have like sort of a pattern of a face inside of a popcorn ceiling wall, right? Which would probably make it much more likely for you to perceive an actual face and then maybe even entity experience. So that's a whole other thing. So there's this interaction between your visual input and what your processing does. And in academia, there's this whole line of research where they're trying to say like, okay, if we just replicate the visual experience of being under the influence of LSD or psilocybin, for example, what does that do to people's consciousness, to people's experience, people's phenomenology? Like, do they actually get high, essentially, from that, right? And there's a whole stack of, like, I don't know, at this point, like 6 or 7
like replicated in the sense of put them in a visual field that is filled with the sorts of visual information that you would have from the psychedelic?
So in practical terms, what they're doing for the most part, what is in the academic literature right now is this deep dream algorithm, which is it was developed by Google, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, or maybe a little more, because they had this generative they had these these image classifying models. So you give it an image and you ask it, hey, what's in the image? And it says it's a dog, right? And they wanted to understand better how the black box works, so to speak. So what they did is they kind of simplified, but they kind of reversed the algorithm. And instead of saying, hey, tell me what's in this image, they said, hey, whatever this part of your network is best at recognizing, find it in this image, and actually, like, in every iteration, change the image to be more like that what you would want it to be in order for it to trigger you, right? So essentially, like, they move it more and more towards, okay, if this image, how would this image have to look in order for this part of the network to be like, oh yeah, this is a dog, right? So that's why if you give it an image of whatever and you keep running iterations on it, it's going to slowly turn into a dog. And then they were like, well, this looks really trippy. This looks kind of like LSD. And then the media ran with it. And there were a bunch of articles like, oh, scientists gave AI LSD and whatever. But if you look at the original publication, then somebody did that in, like, they never made a strong claim that this really does what, like, that there's a strong relation. They were just like, this kind of looks trippy, right? And there's some elements to, like, hey, there's this top-down processing. It's like, there's a relationship there, certainly. But, like,
it was probably all people who had never taken LSD making these comments too.
Yeah, but also, like, there legitimately is some degree of reasoning behind that, but they were not trying to make a strong claim about neuroscience or anything, right? Well, at some point, somebody just made an open source repository where you could apply that to video, which also required you that, because the hallucinations are not consistent frame by frame, it also has to have a second algorithm on top to make it look like sort of consistent across frames, and it kind of looks fucky, and it really does not look nearly as much as these substances anymore than the individual images did. The individual images were like, you can kind of see where this is going. For the video, they had to put a whole second algorithm on top of it to make it consistent, and it really didn't move. Like, the whole dynamics of the thing were not like psychedelics at all, but it was enough for them to get it published. They put it in VR and put people in there, gave them some altered states questionnaires that were not designed to capture this, because those questionnaires have questions about, oh, how did your visual experience change? And because their visual experience had changed because they were looking at something trippy, they were like, oh, look, this means that they had an altered state. And then all of a sudden you got that published, right? The thing is, they never really tried hard to verify, like, why would this, like, what about the dynamics of this whole thing? They never really talked about it. They were just like, oh, let's just not look at that. And they also didn't mention the input to the whole system at all. Like the first thing they did, they just used, they just went out in front of their office and did a 360 recording of whatever was there, and then put it through the algorithm, and then had a couple of people put on the headset and fill out a questionnaire, and then voila, you have a publication, I think in Nature even. And after that, people never questioned it, because then there was one example where it was published and it stated that this setup of this algorithm replicates these effects, and everybody afterwards just used that. But the studies that came afterwards all used different input, and nobody ever talked about what input they're using. One of them used like nature scenes, right? But it didn't say like, why did you choose a different input, right? And one used actually scenes from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is like and they don't even mention it, right? But if you look at it, it's like, okay, that's what they're doing. This is not even, it's already processed and already made to look like psychedelics, and then you put an algorithm on top that changes how it looks. But like, how can you just not talk about the input to the system, right? But nobody questions it.
What is the goal?
They were just trying to make it comparable to psychedelics. So they analyzed like brain entropy and cognitive flexibility.
They were trying to understand structurally what is happening to the brain.
No, they were trying to show that, well, maybe the visual experience itself is enough to put you in an altered state similar to the substances, and then that could have all sorts of consequences. And it would be, if it works, it's really interesting for understanding how these substances work, because really, like, it's not clear which part of them really has the effect there. Like there's serotonin receptors, or even in your early visual processing stack, in your eyes, right? For example, so there's already changes that occur there, and then you have a deep stack of things that happen. So maybe the stuff that's happening in our eyes is more important than that's what's happening with the serotonin in the brain. And it's just the way that it changes the visuals, and that has all sorts of downstream consequences. That goes into an area they call neuroaesthetics, right? Which is like, how does your visual or aesthetic, but mostly it's about vision input, relate to the conscious experience of it? That's something that people usually get into when they have tenure, because it's kind of, they want to be secure first. It's not really taken that serious, but it's legit. Like people use this to design airports and things like that. And whatever.
Some airports more than others.
Yeah, no, and not to make it the most comfortable, but at least to some degree. Like people use it to design seats in public transportation. It's used there, like sort of these fractal. You can say
really interesting, because I feel like much of the designed world right now is designed to be incredibly hostile and unpleasant. And I don't necessarily know that it is the intention of the design, but I think that people aren't thinking enough about these questions.
They want to keep you moving, because and they want to keep you moving is always a difficult thing to say, because who are they? How much is it individuals, people's intention, and how much is it just cultural dynamics? And I'm sort of agnostic about that for the most part. But what it leads to is that we're not really designing spaces that are for you to like hold it, like just stay and be like, okay, what, like reflecting, right? They just want to keep you in a cycle of like consume.
Oh, yeah, it's crazy. So like one of the worst airport experiences we've had recently is we took a really cheap airline that went through Las Vegas. And so it was like Spirit Airlines. And you walk out of the airplane, and it's a circular hub that has gates all around the edge of it. And there are maybe 5 times more people in the space, maybe even 10 times more people than there are seats. And the entire central area has been cleared of seats, and it's just a ring of gambling machines. And so it's, they're like super tall. They're probably like 4 or 5 times the height of a person, super bright lights, like all the screens are flashing. Nobody's actually playing them, but the people are sitting at the benches and like slumped over waiting for their trains or for their flights. And it's just full and utter chaos. Everybody's on the floor, and you're just like, you're not meant to leave this space. You can't go anywhere. You're getting off gate here and 2 hours later getting onto this gate. But it just seems so intentionally like somebody sat in a room and they were like, well, maybe we can make some money and we'll put these gambling machines here. But it just seems like every design is intended not to think about what would make this a pleasant experience for the people that are going to spend 4 hours here, and more just, are we capable of extracting a little bit more off of this surface? which is really tragic because I think that if there was this deeper sense of the importance of aesthetics, where, it's not something magical about trees that make you enjoy leafy neighborhoods, it's just the fact that it is a cohesive, harmonic space that is nice to be in, that we might actually have a world where people are friendlier to each other and they're kinder and they're calmer. But it seems like we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, or even maybe today, about the way that we're starting to design augmented reality interfaces. And so you wear a pair of glasses, and the glasses are able to smooth over all of the unpleasantness of the world that you're experiencing. And I worry that even as we're finding out more and more about what creates a pleasant state, the way that we're going about actually implementing that for people is not creating the pleasant space, but is finding shortcuts that run around the fact that the spaces are so unpleasant and give you the ability to kind of tune them to whatever it is that you prefer.
Whether you want the Apple vision or the Google vision onto the world, you
Yeah.
can basically choose your reality. We are technically, in terms of hardware, we're still quite far from those visions. Like most of the things that you see are now like the Meta Ray, like these glasses that are like form factor wise, actually people can wear them and they're affordable. What they have is like tiny screen somewhere in the corner that can be like a teleprompter and stuff. And that's where we are. Like we're still, it's not clear at all how long it's going to take to build devices that are cheap enough and good enough to really do that. But conceptually, it's really interesting.
But like of the research that you've seen about the interface between the visual field and then the internal experience, like I would be surprised if a psychedelic visual field ends up producing the same sorts of internal experiences that the psychedelic state does.
That's exactly where the research is right now. So there is a lot more. There's a lot more people doing this now that has sort of developed over the last few years. There's a really good paper I would recommend looking at that. It's called More Than Meets the Eye by Marco Akil, where he really takes a review of like the different sort of evidence that we have for this. That there really does seem to be something there. And even though I'm criticizing those Deep Dream papers, the original idea was good, and they did bring this up, and people kept running studies. They kept it in the field, right? And people can write grants, and that's the way it works. There's just very obvious blind spots in there that nobody wants to talk about. It's the part that I'm criticizing. But the general theme of it really seems to be going in this direction that, depending on how we start to interpret these results, that there is a lot that can be done with just changing how we look at the world. And this ties back into what I was saying about Andre's idea of projective intelligence, that like your senses are kind of, there's always this low level synesthesia to some degree, for some people more than for others, but there is a somatic element to visual design. Like if you see spiky things, you kind of feel them, like especially if there's a risk for you to fall onto them. If they're like behind a glass wall, then okay, it's not that big of a deal, but still, like there is like you get this bodily feeling based on visual input, and there is a lot that can be done. Like the Qualia Research Institute is very convinced that the visual experience can be used to tune you into all sorts of different states. And this ties also into this literature on flickering lights. So flicker light stimulation, or sometimes it's called brainwave entrainment. That's more the terms that folks at like the Monroe Institute and things like that like to use, because it sounds cooler. But and sometimes these people don't know about each other, just because some part of the research calls it flicker light stimulation and others call it brainwave entrainment, and they're doing the same thing in parallel and don't know about each other because language. But part of what that shows is that the people, this is again work by Timo, who I was mentioning earlier, who's like trying to map these altered states. He's in the last years done fMRI studies with like just 10 hertz strobing. So first they try to figure out what's the frequency that tends to induce the strongest experiences in people. And there's a lot of variation with flickering light. Some people get seizures. Some people are like, well, it's just on and off what you want. And some people meet God. And there's everything in between. And like some people have come out of those experiences and are like, I need to integrate this for a couple of weeks, right? Like everything in that can happen.
Straight from a flickering light.
Yeah, it's just straight white flickering light. These are things have
for like a minute, for 10 minutes.
And so in those, it can go really quickly, but in those studies that he did, I think there were 45-minute long sessions, so quite a bit.
And the light's not changing at all. It's just like a white light that's flickering.
It's just a white light that's flickering. I think they were using the Luthia lamp, which has like a backlight halogen lamp that's like constant lighting, and then some really powerful LEDs that are actually strobing. But these things have been around for a while. Like the earliest accounts of somebody apparently you can look at the sun and just wave your hand in front of you. You can produce some flickering, and then they have these lamps that spin, and people are doing this in all sorts of ways. But he did an fMRI study on that after they figured out that 10 hertz seems to be the range where people get the strongest experiences. And there he could show that in really high detail that you can induce thalamocortical hyperconnectivity just by straight up flickering lights with nothing else. And thalamocortical hyperconnectivity is a big part of what people think about in this like top-down, bottom-up processing, brain entropy, however you want to call it. Brain entropy is sort of like some parts of the researchers they don't like if you even talk about that. And the free energy principle can be a bit of a...
But it sounds like people are trying to use these psychedelic experiences and recreate them in different ways because they want to understand something fundamental about the brain, how it produces this experience that we have.
Yeah, and by taking parts of it, it makes it more manageable, because these substance-based experiences, they act all over your body, and they're really complex. Like you have neurons that are serotonin receptive all over your body, so it's really difficult to figure out what, like, maybe those in your gut are really important. Like, who the fuck knows?
Well, it's crazy. We tried to... Before we even really tried psilocybin, we were trying to read a lot about how it works and the mechanism, and it's like the primary binding site was like the kidney, like the adrenal glands or something. It's just bananas, and then they're like, serotonin after that. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so it's not, because I actually studied neuroscience as an undergraduate, and it's like this very pretty story for the most part, at least back then. This was like a couple centuries ago, but like this idea that like a chemical binds here and it activates this pathway that's well understood. And psychedelics just don't seem to check those boxes in any way.
Yeah, especially if you look at the what they're doing now with ibogaine. Ibogaine, really, at least the early research that was coming out, and early research on these things always has to be taken with a big grain of salt, because it's sort of fanatics that are doing that research, because it's really hard to do that research. So the people who are actually going to end up doing it are really convinced that it's valuable, and that just ends up one way or another biasing the research hugely, which doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's just, you have to be careful with the first people who do anything. And usually it follows this hype curve. The same thing we do see with psychedelics right now, even meditation. Like there's more and more research coming out showing like the dark side of mindfulness and about enlightenment of psychedelics, because in the beginning you have the fanatics, they introduce it to the field. As it becomes trendy, more and more people who have a more neutral relationship to it also run studies, then the evidence gets more murky, and then it sort of drops off. And there's an interesting paper that part of why this research on psychedelics stopped in the 70s is not just because it was prohibited, but also because the evidence started to become too murky. Because like too many people who are not like convinced of it in the first place got into it from different angles, and they were finding all sorts of different things, because it's a really messy thing, right? And so people were like, it's kind of hard to, like, we don't really know what this is. It does all sorts of stuff. The evidence is all over the place. And even right now, people are not replicating anything in psychedelics research. Like everybody runs their own study. Like every one of them it's really hard to compare between studies, because people don't want to replicate. It's not sexy, right? It's really costly and really hard to run a psychedelic study in the first place. And you're really convinced that the thing that you do will show how it's cool. And so everybody does their own thing. And it's like, anyway.
We were talking in kind of two parallel threads. One was the flashing light.
Yes,
that induced this experience. And so I want to wrap that. And then you were also making a point about ibogaine. And its early days.
Yeah, so in ibogaine, what they're reporting is that, okay, in addiction, we have a relatively clear idea of mechanistically, you are supposed to have like there are receptors that build up, and that's why it takes a long time to get rid of that, because your biological system has changed. But if you just take ibogaine and meet God, all of a sudden you can break that within a few days. Like, how the fuck does that match with our mechanical system at all? Like, it just seems like a big mismatch in story, and it's going to take a while to square the two, I assume, right? And that's why I was like, when you're talking about receptors, it's like one of those stories where at least the anecdotal, and they're starting to do proper studies on this report, seems like, well, this really puts into question our model of addiction and substance dependency on the receptor level. Like, doesn't mean all the tools we have developed based on that mechanistic understanding are wrong or bad all of a sudden. It just means, well, there's another level of complication here probably that we didn't think about. And to tie it back
to the same thing also should apply to flashing lights. Like the idea that you can flash a light at 10 hertz and meet God seems somehow to break any frame for which I understand mystical experiences in.
Yeah. So the idea there really, like, from a mechanistical point, you would say like, well, maybe it's really just it's like sort of the bottom up input is overwhelming. Like your system does not know how to interpret this, but it keeps coming at the right rate. Where like there's just signal coming and just jamming it in, but your brain just has nothing to doesn't know what the fuck this is supposed to be, and therefore it opens up as the prediction errors build up is one way to think about it. It like realizes, hey, my predictions are wrong, and it just keeps widening the scope of interpretation because it realizes like at first it tries to be like, okay, this is a chair, so it's a chair, fine, right? But if it really cannot make any sense of what's going on, it's going to widen its scope of interpretation until it finds something that makes sense. And at the same time, it really seems to be the amount of light is really important, right? The brightness of those lamps seems really important. So there's probably some physical element to really how much light you're jamming into the eyes for some reason that we don't fully understand yet. But this is a pretty vague understanding. That's like, okay, so this opens you up to be more projective about it, and at the same time it really seems like it wants something from you. It's not just a white wall that you're looking at, it's like really forceful, like it's asking something of you because there's constantly energy being pumped into the system. So it like really raises the energy without providing any proper interpretation of it. And that's how that might be the mechanism of how it becomes this mystical experience. But what they found within that one as well is that people who have more intense visuals, usually these are like geometric, and there's a good reason to suspect that the type of visual experiences, like low-level geometric experiences that people have, are actually to some degree visualizations of the structure of their visual cortex. Because really there's nothing, like it really starts to become a visualization of the information pattern, and the information pattern really is just how it gets, like your processing system itself, right? It's similar to the deep dream thing in the sense that it would become, instead of you interpret the thing that's there, you're doing sort of the opposite, that you're projecting the system that you have, and you're visualizing the structure of your processing stack by projecting it onto the input, because it's the best idea you have about how to interpret this thing. And the people who have stronger visual experiences based on these flickering lights, they also tend to have stronger altered states experiences, at least report them, right? So that ties it again together with the literature on visualizing the psychedelic experience more like concretely by using these deep dream algorithms, and then that ties in with the neuroaesthetics literature, and then the QRI have their own whole system, but that's part of why they really work on these couple oscillators, but also on the replication of psychedelic states. They're much better at that than the deep dream people. They're using some deep dream in there, but they're much smarter about, like, their replications are so much better than anything that academia is doing, but they don't have a way of getting it in there yet, because they don't have to get ideas into academia, you need to follow certain rules, and they're not really playing by them.
Yeah, I mean, is it enough to have somebody who's on the inside who likes the project, who's willing to publish with them?
We'll see. We'll see. Next month, we'll have a satellite retreat attached to one of the big consciousness conferences. It's like co-funded by the QRI, and that's where all the people who are working on Deep Dream will be there. My friend Timo will be there, who's working on the flickering lights, and the QRI folks will be there. So I'm trying to bring all those people together so that we can like figure out like, okay, how can we start to really cohesively make sense of that? Right now it's quite fragmented, and that's sort of where I also see my role in general. I'm not the person who goes really deep into one thing. I tend to be more the person who's like trying to see the pattern and put them together, and then put people in touch with each other. That's sort of where I see my role.
Okay, so
yes.
This is actually, there's an interesting thread here, because so far we've been kind of talking around the content of psychedelic experiences, what they mean, but a lot of what I see this equipment-based evocation of psychedelic experiences to offer is the ability to engage with the material, so to speak, without having to take drugs.
Yeah.
And so what is the benefit of that and what is the drawback of that? Because you talked earlier about, when you do enough research onto meditation and enlightenment and psychedelic experiences, and it's no longer being done by true believers, you start to see that, okay, so there's this bin of really good stuff, there's this bin of not so good stuff. And so I wonder if we can map all of that out. But I also wonder,
Could I just add one
Yes.
layer to that? I do want to end up there, but I still have a couple of
okay,
questions.
let me write this down then.
I just want to make sure and it's okay if Till doesn't have the answers to this, but I want to make sure that we
Thank you.
enumerate the reasons
You're
why.
forgiven.
So we've talked largely about the fundamental science, right? So psychedelics have this utility for understanding how the mind works, how the brain produces the mind, or the mind interacts with the brain, or whatever the hell's going on, right? This is a good doorway into maybe isolating pieces of perception and so forth. And that's really interesting for humanity in general. I think that's proving to be interesting. But we also just sort of skipped over the fact that these things can cure people of lifelong addictions, right? Like, what the fuck? That's crazy. And there are illegal substances, right? You can't buy ibogaine over the counter to cure your cigarette addiction, but you can buy cigarettes over the counter. So, this is very, very bizarre. And it seems like a real awesome piece of the puzzle for humanity to keep these things at least in our attention, or at least in our peripheral attention. Then we kind of danced over the cosmic connectivity issue too. I guess we explored it a little bit with our own personal experiences, but I want to see if I'm missing anything, and if you have any insight into the mechanism by which these experiences allow people to change who they are, and and obviously this, I hate disclaimering after disclaimer. Your mileage may vary, but there does seem to be some potential for people to rewire themselves in a fundamentally better way. I think good and better are actually reasonable adjectives here, because people do realize, in this chaotic experience sometimes that I could be doing a better job at myself. So I just want to make sure that we center that there are other perhaps valuable aspects of these experiences besides just understanding how the brain works, although that's often where the intellectual attention gets aimed, that's cool too. But
put a handle on that.
Well,
what do we do with them in practical terms in society, right? That's part of what you're asking. Okay, so now all of that's cool, but also there's the engineering side of it, I guess.
Yeah.
Where does it lead? So I think one of the fundamental reasons why these substances are not nearly as society-wide acceptable for big societies is their unpredictable nature. Is that we don't know, and this ties it into the non-pharmacological things as well, because the non-pharmacologicals at least tend to be a lot more understandable. They're a lot simpler in terms of their mechanism, and in many of them at least, right? That's why right now Rituals, the cosmetics company, open up these things they're called mind spas, where you essentially have an anilatron, right? It's vibration and binaural beats and flickering lights, and they tell you they're oh, this is all science-based, but they don't reference any science, literally no reference to anything. They just say it's.
Did you end up going to one of those pods?
No, I don't. I'm not sure if the Berlin one is open yet, but I know what to expect roughly. I'm just curious. But they basically sell it to you as, oh, it's like meditation, but you don't need to learn it and you don't need to do anything. You just get into the box and then it does the meditation effect
in the
for
box.
you. Yeah. It's all these, they literally say all these top athletes use meditation and that's how they're so cool. And you're also a top athlete behind your laptop. And that's where you should also have those benefits, but nobody has the time. So just get an hour box and then you get all the benefits of meditation, but you don't need to learn anything.
And that can seem like the benefits of psychedelics too. It's right. You don't need to do all this training. You just eat this whatever.
Yes, but that's exactly.
But you don't have the ejection knob or whatever, the ejection cord.
So when you look at what psychedelics actually did make it into somewhat scalable into culture in terms of therapeutics, it's ketamine. Ketamine, yeah, that's the one where you really see in part it's a dissociative substance.
We were just talking about. I was looking at Nasty because she told me that Elon Musk is strung out on ketamine.
Yeah, he's gorked up his mind.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I haven't looked at the news in 2 weeks, but I just accidentally clicked Google News this morning or yesterday, and I saw a headline Musk was changing his mind about everything, and Nasty. Nasty was well, he's strung out on ketamine now. I was I didn't even know you could get strung out on ketamine.
These videos of him just like standing in like the Oval Office and like doing press conferences and stuff. And
Those phases would usually be more amphetamine related, but it could also be a mix. And ketamine definitely has become a lot more prevalent, and I have a lot to say about that. So the reason why ketamine has become acceptable as a psychedelic therapeutic, it's not a classic psychedelic because it's dissociative, but the effects that people report are, a lot of them sound like these very trippy experiences. But it's an anesthetic. It's used as a pain medication, and it's mainly used in like emergency situations and stuff because it doesn't suppress your breathing. It's one of the only things that really can help with that without suppressing your breathing, which is really important in emergencies. But if you're in an ambulance, you would never give somebody LSD. Right? Like that's like the last thing you would do. You're like, this is some of the most horrific experiences, and now you're giving them a psychedelic. Like, so what fucks up here, right? So the thing is, it's a dissociative, which fundamentally means that it's dissolving your sense of self in many ways. Like, dissociation is a hard topic to talk about in terms of how you understand it, but really...
It's pathologically adjacent too, right? Because a number of these psychopathologies are dissociative as well.
Yeah, there's different... It's used also as a trait and as a state, and then there's a substance thing, and it's really kind of difficult to keep a hold on. But the main thing is that really there's very little fear and anxiety associated with these ketamine trips, because essentially there's one way of thinking about it, that there's nothing to be afraid for, because your sense of self, the thing that you would worry about, is kind of dissolving, right? So you're like, well, all this crazy shit is happening, but like there's no, like, that's just how it is. It's more like a dream, right? Yeah. It's very much related to more like a dream type state. It's also really hard to keep memory of these things because you're dissociated. They're not getting integrated properly. It's very much more to think about as like a dream state. And nevertheless, it does... I have to do a quick PSA on the magic word of the psychedelics community, neuroplasticity. People always talk about it induces neuroplasticity, and the way it's used, even by the big folks like Rick Doblin, who on a personal level I love the guy. He's a really jolly fella, and he's great.
I don't know him.
Rick Doblin.
We're going to meet with him this summer, but I don't know him personally yet.
He's the guy who like single-handedly brought psychedelics back into the therapy space.
And he was the one where this was a very weird thing where he was on Rogan. Mm-hmm. And if you go and you look at Rogan's, he's this podcaster. He's really popular. If you go to his YouTube page. Mm-hmm. All of the videos have hundreds of thousands of views, except for the Dublin interview, which has 8,000 views. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, I think that they must have been talking about something that was shunted down by the algorithms, because I don't think...
The latest appearance of him, because he's been on there multiple times.
I think the latest, or maybe the one before that.
So Rick is somebody who came out of the like 70s consciousness culture, and then he really decided that, okay, these are really, MDMA especially is a really powerful therapeutic, and he really wanted to do it right and push it through the system, and has put like 25 years or something. He's running the company MAPS, and he's the one who's done like these really long-term trials with the FDA and whatever, right? And where finally the FDA recently decided that they're not going to approve MDMA-assisted therapy. They was like, well, it's such a magical thing, why wouldn't they do it? Well, if you listen to his interview on Rogan, what he's saying is that, yes, the results were pretty good, but the study, the comparison group, they just got the therapy protocol, because in order to provide the MDMA therapy, they also developed a new therapy protocol. It's really involved. It's like a 2-day thing, because they had to develop a whole new therapy protocol. And the problem is, as far as I can tell from what he said on there, that the difference between the group that didn't get the MDMA and that group that did is just not big enough to warrant the risks. And he makes it seem like, oh, look, our MDMA group was super cool, and our non-MDMA group was also great. That just means our therapy protocol is great. Which, like, yeah, it does. But the problem for the FDA is, in order to warrant a breakthrough psychedelic status, it has to be a certain level above what's there. And if they are like, well, your general therapy, basically their general protocol was already too good. So the comparison between like the therapy protocol together with compared to the therapy protocol with MDMA was just not enough of a benefit. And that's one of the reasons.
That's crazy, because you look at the way that they approve like breast cancer drugs and tons of pharmaceuticals. the same complaints for things that have gotten approved and are now in use can be easily said.
I mean,
what are the dangers? Just
dangers?
cardiac and overheating?
I don't think there's that much of danger.
Right,
Really, it's
right.
mostly like the stigma. Like in terms of like dealing with the dangers, MDMA is one of the safer ones. But like that's part of for one that it's more it's just going to be cost prohibitive. Like, so part of why MDMA, even if it does get approved, wouldn't have that big of an effect, in my opinion, is because it takes too long. It's too long acting. It would be really expensive. It would take you like 20 to 30 grand to go through that protocol. And how do you make sure that you're ready for it? That's, if you go back, it's where we finally invoke William James and his religious conversion therapies. Like, one of the key things that comes out of his research is that there's a lot of subconscious processing that's going on, and then there's a trigger, and that leads to the transformation. But how do you tell if the subconscious processing has been done, right? If they're ready for a phase transition, right? It literally is like this idea of a phase transition, that there's a lot of processing happening that you cannot really see yet, and then you need the right trigger, and then you have a conversion. But if you can't really do that, it's not by default going to be that helpful. So it's going to be really expensive. You need really long sessions. It's just logistics of it don't check out to me, really. With ketamine, what you get is you don't really get the anxiety, and you don't even need therapy during it, because it's just the experience. So what they have is, they call them pump and dump clinics, where you go in, you get the drip, you sort of plug in for an hour, and then you go home. And there's like basically no therapy that goes along with that. And part of why they say this is still going to do the trick is because of this magical concept of neuroplasticity, where neuroplasticity is this idea that you can make new connections in your brain, and you can like chemically induce that there's, you can like increase the chance of making new connections. That sounds great. You can like rewire your brain. Awesome. Problems with that. First, nobody has ever shown that the amount of neuroplasticity as far as I know, that the amount of neuroplasticity that gets induced with these substances in the human brain is actually significant. You have like some test tube results that's like yes, it does induce some neuroplasticity in some cultures, but does that mean the doses that we're giving to people actually does any significant amount in people? Is really hard to test, and as far as I know, nobody has done that. Secondly, neuroplasticity is not just by psychedelics. You can take a cold shower or like anything surprising. Like, there's a lot of ways to induce neuroplasticity. They might not be as long lasting as those, and I'm not saying that it's wrong to say that it's important, but it's not being put into context well enough. And the third and most important thing is that neuroplasticity is neutral. It allows you to make negative connections just as well as it allows you to make positive connections. And it really is like invoked as this like magical term oftentimes, because it makes you think like, oh, my brain is going to grow, so it's going to be better. And it's like, no.
I mean, I have a sense that it's not even like a neuromechanical change that occurs. I have a feeling that, the same way if you went and were inspired by a performance, that it might change you in some way, like, damn, I wish I could play guitar like that or something. So then you go and you get a guitar and you get a teacher and you go down this path, right? Your life is fundamentally different because of...
I agree, but how do you tell that to the man? The man understands there's a neurochemical change, and they can understand that you can put it in a pill. It fits into the mechanistic model, and
this is where a lot of churches are springing up as workarounds, right? Because if it's if it's a religious ceremony, where you ingest this substance, then that actually, to me,
I think that's a much better place for it. Honestly, it's like this. The man is perfectly happy to give you cigarettes and alcohol. They don't care if you're doing well. Like, I can't stomach this argument about the safety of it. I'm like, you guys, like, I can go kill myself with a bottle of liquor right now.
That's not it's not the safety. What I'm saying is that if you tell the man that really it's not about the chemical change, it's about the experience, then it's like, where do I put that on my piece of paper? Like, where do I fit that in my Excel sheet, the experience, right? It's tricky.
Like, psychotherapy is FDA approved.
Yeah, but it also goes through there's a ton of regulations on it, and there's also a lot of, like, it also leads, there's a lot of negative, therapy is one of those things that's also, like, now that it's more and more popular, there's a lot of negative things that keep popping up.
I think the scariest thing about therapy is the fact that people learn how to be more manipulative. That's like the direct negative outcome.
I want to tie the bow on ketamine. So the thing about ketamine, what it's really great at, and the way it's even approved for in Germany, is like acute suicidality. Like, it seems to be really magical at releasing this like idea that you want to kill yourself, these suicidal ideations, which kind of makes sense if if you don't care about yourself anymore because it's kind of dissolved. You're like, well, you get out of this loop if you think about it.
If you have like an episode.
Yeah, exactly. It can break you out of that loop because there's no reason to kill something that you don't care about as much anymore. That would be one simplistic way to think about it. Whether it's correct or not, I don't know. But it really does seem to work really well and really reliably for acute suicidal ideations. The other thing is that it seems to be pretty reliable. These ketamine therapy protocols are usually you get like 6 to 8 sessions within the span of like 2 weeks, where you go into a clinic, you get hooked up for an hour, and then you go home. And there's not much preparation or integration for the most part because that's the best business model. It's pump and dump. You just come in, you get the plug, you go home. It's cheap, and it sort of seems to be effective at raising your baseline, like reducing your baseline depression quite significantly for around like 3 months, and then it sort of tapers off. Which, what that should tell you is that that's the period of time that you can use to make changes in your life, because the depression is not just in you. Most of the time, it's part of your circumstances. It's your social circle, it's your surroundings, it's your habits. Like, it really can be really important to think about yourself as being embodied in your daily routines. The more often you do something, even the simple things like for the fucking choice of your pillow or whatever it is, right? Those are part of your sense of self, and you have like there's a lot of reinforcement from the world, which is part of why we can go on these wild, chaotic journeys and become a coherent self again. It's because our self is not just in us. It's also, it like feeds back from our surroundings, right? You can wake up and you're like kind of confused, like, oh, well, I had a wild dream, but you see your room and the people you know, and like all of that feeds back to your sense of self. But it also means if you have this period where your baseline gets raised, use it to make changes in your actual life, and those can have really good long-lasting results. That's where you get the trajectory effects, right? Like even small changes can, on the long term, really do something. So that's where I think that's the way these ketamine therapies could really be beneficial.
It's like you're setting up a formative period. You know, people always talk about like coming of age stories, like, you know, Hollywood movies, or like the kid goes through this journey, and the girl and the bad guys, and you like have this formative period when you're in your youth. But you can have formative periods beyond your youth as well, right? And maybe that's through like something terrible, but it seems like these experiences set you up to have a period of formative transition. Yeah.
So tying it back into how can we actually how do the logistics of psychedelic therapy how can they work out within the Western medical system, right? So that requires a bunch of things for integration. You can have these retreat centers that are popping up, and those also kind of work for psilocybin and LSD, and they are sort of off-grid, but they're like those can work, but it's also a tricky business because they can turn really culty, and there's a really hard balance between like the traditional uses of these substances. They often come with a big framework where they have a whole religious or whatever framework to integrate those experiences, and that's sort of the Western medical framework is really, they're trying to be as neutral as possible, whatever neutral means, right? But they don't want to provide any of that. And that makes it really hard to make use of these substances. And so you have these retreat things that all do their own thing, but that's a lot of business. And I see
they're very expensive in the United States where they're cropping up, and they're very clinical. And I think this medicalization thing is actually a real just dead path.
So it's like they're legal in Oregon, and so there's psychedelic treatment centers in Oregon, and they're so sterile. It's like a converted office park building.
Like, think about dentist's office.
Yeah, it's like a dentist's office with like overhead fluorescent lights, and it's like $2,000 even for the room that's just a dentist's office.
That's part of what at the Inside Psychedelics conference here in Berlin a couple of years ago, I was talking to Matthew Johnson, who was one of the main dudes running the psychedelic stuff at Johns Hopkins.
We've had him,
yeah. And he was really interested in the sort of aesthetics work that we were doing with VR, because within that space, we're really trying to figure out how do the aesthetics play into this. And he was like, yeah, these therapy rooms that we're designing, they just suck. There's just something that got stuck. It's like, and oftentimes they also have specific, they have like Buddhist iconographies, and then people who are not of that religion are like, well, it's not for me, I guess, right? And they're not really thinking about the neuroaesthetic elements of it at all. It's like none of that is really worked into the system. And that's part of where we think we can provide a lot of insights from these non-pharmacological sites. And then there's also the option to combine non-pharmacological states with low-dose substance, right? Where you might say, well, at the high dose, it becomes really unpredictable. But if we can merge those two levels, where you have lower doses, also make it much easier to integrate into the medical system because they're less worried about heart and all the other things that already are, like, depending on who you ask, not to be worried about, but still on paper, that's something that people care. And if you can tell them, well, you give them a much lower dose, but we use neuroaesthetics, then that can work. So there's a group in Zurich who got a grant approved to use virtual reality and DMT together, low dose DMT together for chronic pain. So specifically what they're doing, they already have like VR body perception based therapy for getting rid of like these attention knot based chronic pains. It's the best way to describe it, where you have like a chronic pain in your hand, for example, right? But we cannot really find anything physically wrong with your hand. It's a little bit like phantom limb type pain. It really seems like something in your level of perception is like stuck there. It's like you can think of it as an attention knot or geometric frustration in your oscillators if you're going the QRI way, which is not a bad way to think about it. And what they figured out is that if you show them your hand in VR and you just turn it blue or transparent or you fuck with the visuals a little bit, it can really help them to release that sort of pain, right? Similar to the way in which you have phantom limb pain, so you're missing a limb but you still have pain there. What you do is you visualize that limb for somebody again, and you visualize the process of getting rid of that limb. Usually they use that with mirrors, which doesn't work if if both of your legs are missing, then no mirror is going to help you. But you can do that in VR now, where you just make them see that they have legs again, and then they can watch the legs disappear. And going through that process can help the body and the brain understand that, well, okay, this is gone, and now I can close that chapter. In a similar way, for whatever reason, fucking with the visuals of your hand can really help. And they have been, not, as far as I can tell, not very systematic about it so far. They've just been messing with it a little bit. And they are making the argument, if you also give them a little bit of DMT, then you also like loosen up the top-down priors, you make the whole system a little bit more plastic, and we also fuck with the visuals a little bit, and that should do a really good job at releasing the chronic pain. Those sort of things are much easier to integrate into the system. And the other thing about DMT is that it's so short-acting.
Compared to making yourself a better person or something.
That's just really hard to measure and put on paper. Like, I very much agree that those things are super valuable, and that's where like the big, like, if you think about using you want to work with a lever. That's my engineering mind. You want to work at the points where it's like most effective. And religious conversion type experience, like mystical experiences, really seem like it's one experience and you change so many things about your life. Like, we should be able to leverage that. It's really fucking hard.
I mean, this is just like a wider criticism I have of the Western tradition depending increasingly on science to orient it towards the future, right? Because, I understand that the religious institutions in this tradition got wildly corrupted and were, leading to war and famine and chaos and everything else. And so I'm not like saying that's the road we should be marching down, but at the same time, this seems like an over medicalization of something because we're trying to make it something that it's not, right? And I'm not sure that science is ever going to be equipped to tell people how to make their lives better, right? Because it's not something, how I make myself better is not how you make yourself better. There may be some overlaps depending on who we are, but in general, this is a very like personal experience that's mythological in scale.
Jordan Peterson would disagree. Or like, look, the Bible tells you the rules. This is how you follow those rules, but that's an interesting point to tie it to Wolfram, actually, because as far as I understand, so one interesting thing I noticed is when Ogi was on your show like last year, and he said everything is activity. Both of you were like, finally, somebody is talking about activity. And these days, you were like, oh, where's the hard part? Where's the substance to the whole thing?
Well, I think that with Ogi, it was the fact that he had a model for consciousness that was not mysterious or...
I don't think it was all activity. It arose from structures, right? So there was actual molecular intentions. There was these cells that arose from that. Then there's these modules of interaction. The actual structures are interacting with one another. They're dynamical, of course, but there seemed to be a map between the material and the higher level
Experience.
abstraction.
I encourage you to go back and watch your episode with him, because I don't think that's what was happening. I think it was really more like he was, at least that's the way I remember it, and I watched it recently, and it was like more about, for me, the way he described it sounded more like, much more closer to like what Wolfram is talking about, where you have, essentially, I don't like that Wolfram is using the term atomic space, whatever thing, atoms of space. It's really misleading and confusing, and then he's like, essentially what he's saying is that these are points that have no other feature than they're essentially coordinates. Like they have a positional relationship to all the other points that are in space, and that really resonates deeply with me, because once when I was like 19 or something, I was probably listening to some Alan Watts quotes in music, in psytrance or something, getting stoned, I don't know. But I really got this idea that, okay, the only way you can define the position of anything is by defining the position of everything else.
Right.
Because where does space needs to be somewhere, and it cannot really, so that idea really resonates with me. And
Sure.
I think it's similar what he's trying to describe. It's like, he's one of those people that keeps digging. He's like an extreme splitter type. Like he just, if there's a question that he feels like, oh, this is not a satisfying answer, he needs to continue to ask questions until he feels like, okay, there's nothing I can put into question about this anymore. And for his mind, that ended up being like, okay, at the very least, you need a coordinate system so that you can talk about anything at all. But
For a map, absolutely.
But the important part is that for him, observer dependence is extremely important. Like he's really trying to figure out, how can you talk about, like, if you would be able to step out of the human perspective, you still want to define how anything works, then that's the model that you need. If you are in this computationally bounded observer role as a human, I don't think he would have a problem with coming up with a material bottom to things, because that restricts you to a certain time thing as well. Like he's perfectly happy with talking about, as far as I can tell, talking about the material bottom, if you include the bounded observer, right? That from the perspective of humans, it makes total sense to talk about something as a fundamental physical bottom. It just, if I try and be a meta-human, then it doesn't anymore. And the thing,
So that's the part where I get a little bit lost, because I'm like, even if you're a meta-human, and as long as you exist in the world
universe.
of materials, in the universe,
mm-hmm.
then I think you can have a different sense spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a sensorium that's more complex than a human sensorium, and so instead of seeing, the reflections off of the building, you see electromagnetic waves of a frequency that is outside the visual spectrum. Like, fine, you can have different auditory processing, you can have different tactile sense, but at the end of the day, I think that all of this has to emerge from a shared ground. And so the way that I see it is that there's a shared ground, and then there's a filter that you can place over how you see that ground. And I don't think that Wolfram thinks that there's a shared ground.
I mean, for him, just coordinates are enough. That for his mind, that's enough of a shared ground.
What?
The location of the observations, right? Because he's like a extremist empiricist, right?
Yeah.
He's like, this is the rationalism versus empiricist argument. This is like thousands of years old. It's like, does the universe exist if you don't look at it, right? And like, I have a hard time with these things, but it's metaphysical divide. Like, I can't understand why anyone would ever think that, but they can't understand why I would ever think that you know what I mean? So
well, but I have a different experience where I can understand how they think that, but I think they're wrong.
right.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing. So one, you were talking about that he seems kind of gleeful with talking about these things, and that's how it ties into religion and the oppressive role as being like a dogma type thing, and this ties back into why it's so difficult for us to integrate these mystical experiences as valuable things in our society. There's a loop there, difficult, but it's there. That I don't think for him it's that. I think his level of like glee comes from the fact that his mind just doesn't let him accept any explanation that is more complicated than it's just coordinates. Like for some level, he has the type, and I've experienced people like that who really there's just something bugging them about every sort of explanation, and at some point they arrive at one that like finally lets their mind rest. For whatever reason, that's a model that like fits in their processing system, where they're like, okay, like everything is three, everything is like you know, like, and that's fine to have. And I don't think he is dogmatic at all. I don't think he's like. I think people like him have been weaponized by people who like, because part of what if I understand correctly, what you're worried about these sort of mystical explanations that don't have a concrete foundation, like a material foundation, is that you can leverage them to get sort of anything, put like any theory and like create a dogmatic point of view that people cannot understand properly, and that allows you to like be very manipulative and like program people in a very in a way
I think it actually goes one step farther, and I think that it creates a world that doesn't actually matter. Because if you
literally,
it
doesn't matter. Yeah,
And I always, another disclaimer while we're at disclaimers.
Yeah,
when we say that, we're only referring to physics. Right, so it's a very narrow domain in which we are concerned about this, and so the narrow consequence of that is that anyone who operates outside of a material basis for their physics can pretty much say whatever the hell they want, and make it very convincing because they can change. They don't have to abide by physical interactions, and so at some point, like, that this person, it's very hypnotizing to hear these sorts of explanations. And then, it kicks the door wide open to a whole metaphysics of, well, you just can't understand. The priests understand how it works. That's good enough. Like, there was a point in that interview with Wolfram where he literally was I actually started pushing him a little bit on this stuff before I started melting into my chair. And he was just like, well, you need to study mathematics for a gazillion years and then you'll get there. And like, when I was a child, I kind of believed that. And I did study mathematics for a gazillion years. And then I got to like the top of this pyramid and I'm like, this is bullshit. These people have no idea what's going on down there. They just are very good at manipulating these symbols.
I think that it is fundamentally a simulationist view.
Yeah.
And I think that the idea that we live in a simulation is actually deeply damaging to the world.
I think that's a linguistic thing, though, in part, and I do agree, and I do think there is, but I don't think he thinks about that. I think he really much is like he's like a drift. He strikes me as somebody where he's really just trying to make the way his brain works make sense of what he perceives outside. And I think he was more of a mathematician than a physicist. He just likes doing physics because those are interesting mathematical things that have like consequences and then get him involved into other things.
That's right.
But he's doing mathematics that apply to other things.
Until he says something, like, he has a huge following, right? People look up to this guy, like, right? He's a very important priest. Like, he says, I agree with you, until he says something like, well, there's no material basis to reality, but I can't explain to you why that is because you don't possess the specialized view on the universe that I possess. And therefore, I understand it, but I can't really explain it to you. And then the kind of like, kind of thing.
Okay, but so my perception of him there is that that's really what he believes. That I don't think he's like trying to use, like he's not.
No, it doesn't have to be intentional.
Okay, all right.
Or necessarily with malice.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, because that's how I perceive when you talk about it that way.
No, this is there's a spirit that runs through the world that takes delight in things, which perhaps it should not. And it's autonomous, and I don't think that people do wield that spirit for malintent. Certainly, very cleverly, geniusly, even sometimes, right? But it does possess us at times. Like, bad spirits possess us at times. Like, just the tendency to like roll into something, that seems fun or pleasure rather than like or whatever. That's actually a disaster, a train wreck waiting to happen.
Because I think that with ideas, there are two ways that you can go. There's one idea that you can go that all ideas ought to be explicable to anyone that is curious about them. And then there's the other direction, which is that there's a select class of people who understand the idea, and you must be initiated into this elite world in order to also be one of those people. And I think that foundationally,
next thing you know, somebody's screwing your wife. Like, it's
yeah, I know. That's the risk of it. I know, but I feel like there's like.
Don't worry, this is for the best, dude. This is all right. You just stand there and watch. Trust me, like, this is gonna get you to the next level of understanding. It's like, okay.
And so I don't think that Wolfram himself is attempting to do anything bad, and I don't think that there's a grain of malice in the man, and I think that you're right, that he just has this brain that thinks in this way, and he has managed to parameterize it fully and to his satisfaction. But my view on it from the outside is I'm like, you belong to a class of mindset that says there are things that some people must just accept as given because they have not been initiated, and that to me feels I don't like it.
I don't think I agree. I don't think for him it feels like they're not initiated. I'm not, but that's too much projecting either way. But I feel like this really is that there are fundamentally different ways of processing the world to some degree. And like, I know people that listen to Wolfram and they are like, well, this just clicks. Like, everything he's saying is just immediately, yes, please, immediately, this just makes sense. They're like, this matches the way my inner world seems to operate so well that it's like, yeah, this just, it feels right. They feel at home with that. And other people are like, this is just very abstract. And for them, they're like, this is not abstract. It's very concrete, right? And I think that there is that ties back to the very start of the communication about there's different styles of explaining things in the world, and it's really difficult to figure out what the right education, like, how do you talk to people, because you can't I don't think you can from the jump start with something like the simulation type theory, like that abstract, and really get like the core group of people along for the ride. Like, you need to be much more narrative driven. I tend to be I really love Terry Pratchett and his like story driven way of reflecting on society and things like that, where I think narrative really is the sort of element that allows you to tell, to make meaning while allowing for the updating of things, where you can, that's what humor does in his world, where it's like, by leveraging humor, you can tell a lie that everybody knows is a lie, but still provides meaning. That's what good comedy oftentimes is. That everybody knows that this is not exactly what you're feeling and this is not exactly how it is, but at the same time it reveals something really meaningful about the world. And that's
primarily that there is a moral fabric that can be violated and that we all agree on what it is fundamentally. Like, that's why these jokes are funny, right? Because it's like, you can't fucking say that that's fucked up, right? And everybody's like, yeah, that is. And then we're all actually celebrating the fact that that is kind of fucked up and we should, maybe behave ourselves in accordance.
There is something fundamental about this. Okay, so when I was in school, and people just, like, every year they tell you, well, what we told you in the previous year was kind of not true, and like right, especially in like biology or cells or atoms or whatever you have, they're like, they tell you a model and they present it as this is how it is, and then the next year they're like, well, especially if you get to university, then they're like, well, basically anything you learned in school is like pretty much a lie. Okay,
we're gonna get rained on. Hold on.
Oh no.
By the way, I want to make sure that we're like I'm not picking on Wolfram. Like, this is a very classic, archetypical experience for somebody who's obsessed with the relationality of the physical universe. Like, Terrence Howard is in the same boat as far as I'm concerned. And the comment section, like, to the points about what you made about this works for some people, the comment section on the video is hilarious. Because half the people are like, oh my God, this is the frame I've been looking for my whole life. And the other people are just like, this is corrupt, evil shit. Like, this guy is just a snake oil salesman. What are you doing platforming this guy? And like, I think that is the fundamental fracture that runs through a lot of these mathematical approaches to reality. And so I don't mean to just pick on Wolfram.
So can psychedelics save us? Do we just need to give him LSD and then everything will be all right? No, but I really do feel like that's one of the fundamental challenges that we have as a meaning-making society. Like, can we go take the next step where we set up our entire infrastructure that we have for making sense of the world in a way where we don't have that much of a war between these two factions? Because that has been around for a long time, where we can, because both of those approaches to making sense of the world are really valuable. And on top of that, you have the question of how do you communicate those things down, which is where you bring the moral question in as well, right? There's like, on the one side, you can say, like, for those people who really understand this as a meaning-making process and like can really reflect on it, it might be fine to talk about simulation or other things. But once it gets into the culture and you have people like Thomas Campbell and Joe Rogan, then the results of those things are not as easy. Like you really need to think about it from a different lens. So that's sort of an attached but different question. And I do think that there's a lot of potential for psychedelics for these, in general, for substances as well as non-pharmacological things that help. One of the main things they really do seem to do is allow you to take a little bit of a step back of your phenomenological blinders, right? Like our brain fundamentally it has to create compression algorithms. You cannot, every time you think a chair, be like, what the fuck is a chair? Right? It doesn't, you cannot get anything done, right? So it's not a way in which, this is where we could tie it to enlightenment, but that's for a different time then. But the question is, how much of those states do you need for whom? And that's actually where I think the Quality Research Institute, they have this thing they call the Heart Retreat. It's a high energy awareness something. But what they do is they try and collect a group of interdisciplinary researchers that have enough of an overlap that you can generate really useful interdisciplinary communication, but at the same time enough of a separation where there is meaningful change or like meaningful discussions are happening. That's not too much of an in-group. And within different viewpoints on the same topic that are all in the same like category of like in general meaning-making approach that's more simple, it's still difficult, but more simple. But if you can find out a way to do that for people who have these fundamental different approaches, like Wolfram and what I can't remember the name of the
Terrence Howard?
No, the physicist.
Barandus.
Yeah, exactly. If you can figure out, it's not just going to be psychedelics or these tools itself. It really needs to be a social enterprise where you need to probably bring them to the right space. It's
like a podcast or something, for instance?
I don't think a podcast is good. Like maybe, yeah. I mean, I think the podcast comes after some initiation. I don't think you can just start them cold, like just have them come into a studio and then you have a mediated discussion. And
no. I was just thinking collecting perspectives and assembling them into some format that people are sitting around and finding connections.
But the idea would be that you can get these people to change the way in which they interact with each other, right. So that it's
that's kind of what the conferences are about.
Yeah.
Right, because I think that the podcast is a very one-on-one experience where maybe you hear an idea that spins you off into some new space in the ideal version of it. But ultimately, you do want to be able to get everybody into the same room where they're able to, in the moment, bounce ideas off of each other and see how other people think. And
spend hours together outside of this, right? So they actually connect. And, it's very difficult when you have no relationship with someone to take advice or to take ideas into your own space and like have the vulnerability to maybe be plastic about the way that your expertise runs through you.
You need to essentially do like one way to think about it would be these classic like team building exercises that you have in business, right? Where you bring people together and you like part of what they're doing is they get you to model each other because you interact with each other, which gets into this brain synchrony, and you could do a hyper scanning and hook them up to machines where you scan both of their brains and they connect to an interactive art piece, or you could use this sort of virtual reality things that I was building where you utilize the fact that you can merge body boundaries. I think that actually has a lot of potential. If you go through exercises where they identify with something and then you go through transition stages where their identity of their body fluidly merges with somebody else's and then you bring it back. You really have these experiences of visceral connectedness. But you
just the exercise of it might be enough.
Exactly. But you probably also want to then do things that bring them slightly outside of their comfort zone, but not too much. You could do like cold showers or whatever, or you could do like there's all sorts of tools. And I think actually the business team building exercise world has a bunch of interesting things available there. And then psychedelics can be a part of that. It could be either an acute dose, then I would lean towards low dose, maybe like, I'm not giving any advice here, but I would probably aim for like between 0.5 gram and 1 gram of mushrooms. And I would probably go with mushrooms actually, because like psilocybin more because they are this like, they have more of this empathy component to it, whereas LSD, for example, tends to have more of a technical component. Also, nowadays there's a million research chemicals.
This seems like the perfect
operated.
application for the non-pharmacologicals, though, right? Because you look at some of these people that I'd really want to bring together in these spaces, and like bringing the word drug into the this is not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
But if you're able to have a similar experience that brings the same openness and valency, that might be incredible. Like, this reminds me a bit. Do you know who Nathan Fielder is?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, he's a comedian, but he does this fantastic series called The Rehearsal. It was an HBO series. I think it's still ongoing, but is it the current season that we're watching right now? It's fantastic. This guy's a genius. He basically has obsessed over the fact that almost all plane crashes are due to communication issues between the pilots. So this first officer is too intimidated to...
I've heard this, yeah.
And so he's basically, throughout the season, developed this protocol for getting the crew to learn how to communicate and disagree with one another in a productive, funny way by running this script, essentially, right? Where they just play act some stupid thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's like kind of profound. Like, it is a comedy in some sense, the way he does this, because he's...
But there's profoundness to comedy. That's what I said. We mentioned the other day, that one archetype that is sort of missing from our society is this trickster, this crossroad trickster, right? Like, a lot of indigenous cultures used to have this archetype of this figure that is acting in the space between the chaos and order, right? And whenever you have, it's essentially a communication tool, right? They invoke these spirits whenever they start a new enterprise together. They make offerings to the spirit of communication, because it's like it is intuitive realization that we have different perspectives on the world and we need to agree to some fundamental axioms, right? You can take like the Gödel perspective on it, right? But like whatever system you have, you need to agree that there is limitations, and whatever we do, we need to make sure that we're referring to one connecting thing before we embark on whatever, which fundamentally implies this idea that, well, none of us has the key to the fundamental truth. Like, both of us have value, but you also need to respect the fact that there's this logos, right? The idea of logos in the Bible is that, I mean, it's translated as the word usually, but logos really is more this idea of language, or like of conceptualizing things into a symbol. You could phrase it that way, right? Yeah,
like on your virtuality.
You compress things, and then, but in this crossroad, you need to like sort of. That's why oftentimes these tricksters are like they're not in the traditional cultures. They're not just positive. They're positive and negative. They can be both. They're like you need to. We used to have this aspect of like the sacred clown, right? That's something even Rogan brought that back to awareness, right? Which is really important, that this humor, that's what you mentioned, that it brings up this idea like, yes, we have these rules, they are important to us, and still they're kind of ridiculous, right? And that fundamental message is really important to get this communication stream going, and we don't really...
The comedy with the Nathan Fielder thing is he's like going to like the House subcommittee, and like he's going before all these experts, and he's just so doofy, and like it's such a simple idea, and they're like mired in protocol and paperwork and checklists. They're kind of like the medical doctors approaching psychedelic therapies, right? They're like tied up in all of the wrong things, basically, and he's just kind of like, look, all these planes are crashing for one simple reason, and it's funny because it's just so freaking outrageous, right? It's so simple. And the comedy kind of emerges from the irony of how bloated and strange the approaches are to solving the fundamental problem with flying an airplane, which is we want to make it to the destination safely, right? And we have these, $200 million craft with every single cutting edge technology, triple redundancy, and still the freaking thing is crashed because the pilots don't know how to talk to each other.
That's it's also, maybe we can wrap it up with this, is that this app Brain Candy that we've talked about before, that I've developed with David Lobster, it is part of where I want to go with this. It's like this rhythmic stimulation tool that implements these part of it is this like rhythmic flickering, you have some binaural thing going on, and you have these fractal nature things, right? These fractal fluency principles involved there. But the fundamental thing that I want to get to is that these simple and non-symbolic stimulation patterns, they can really help illuminate different ways of processing the world. Because there are some people where you show one thing to, and they're like completely zoned in. They're like, whoa, this speaks to me in a way that I cannot really describe, but it like really pulls something out of me or whatever. And then other people look at that and they're like, whatever, right?
Or worse, they're like, this is garbage.
Yeah.
How could you even entertain this?
Exactly, and that's fine. But because what we're doing there is, ideally we want to build it out as to be like a community thing where we start to get feedback from individual people, and ideally you also get some questionnaire, like that, you get some more information about how their general way of approaching the world works, so that you can try and build out like a mapping of like, are there patterns of attention processing, for example. There's this attentional resource allocation scale which tries to map things between absorption, which is more people who are good at like actively focusing in on something, and people who are more dissociative, people who are good at like zoning out and just being taken care of. Things like that. It could be different personality types, hyperphantasia versus aphantasia, general high sensitivity people, things along those lines. It's going to be tricky to figure out what to do and how to get people to answer questionnaires because they don't like doing that. But in general, the idea with this system is that we can create a certain variety of stimuli and hopefully create a community of people that try and teach each other how to figure out what works for whom and why, in order to get people thinking about, hey, we perceive the world in a very different way. That's also what brought me to this idea of the startup that I want to build for making public spaces more accessible to people who just have a sensory processing system that diverges from the average to enough standard deviations that it becomes really meaningful. Like, we necessarily build public spaces to be sort of acceptable, even if they keep us running in the mill and they're not really designed to make us contemplate. But we still build them in a way that they are like okay to deal with for the average person. But there are people who are going to deviate from norm, and we never talk about these things because you're going to seem like a bit of a loon if you go to your boss in an office and you're like, hey, this lighting, it really kind of screws with my attention. They're going to be like, what the fuck do you mean? Just like, buckle out, right? So
I love the idea of having these sorts of protected spaces that are carefully designed, because if they're out in the world and neurotypical people start to encounter them and maybe even use them, I think that what we're going to discover actually is that what happens is that people that are more sensitive to the experiences might have a more visceral, obvious reaction to them. But in fact, everyone is actually having a bad time. And so you go into a space that's beautiful and calming and it has good lighting and there's beautiful textures and visuals. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, it's possible to actually feel good in this incredibly hectic, chaotic space. I really hope that it's the first step into generating a more humane and beautifully designed world. Because I think that spirit has gone out of our society. And you look back to, the Art Deco, Art Nouveau, where the door hinges are beautifully manufactured. Vienna, exactly. And so we've lost something in the process of mass production.
Exactly.
Where convenience and speed and whatever else has become the focus. And I really do hope that one of the consequences of more people using psychedelics, of more people having these non-pharmacological psychedelic
mystical experiences really is one of the best ways to think about it. Mystical experience is really hard to define, but I think it is one of the words in that space, linguistics in that space are always kind of tricky because they have a lot of connotation and memetics that come with them. But I do think mystical experience is one of the better ones. Some people like spiritual, some like religious, whatever, but I think mystical.
Yeah, I think so. And it's I think that Shiloh and I are incredibly lucky because we have the forest and the river to go to. And it is so easy to have a mystical experience in beautiful nature. And we come into the city and we talk to people who never go to a natural space that isn't touched by the hands of humans, that they don't have easy access to it. Because if you're on a trail or if you're in some preserve where everything is perfectly manicured and there's little signs that tell you where to go, I think that even having a few pieces of human touch on the landscape break you out of this to a degree that we don't have to wrestle with. And so the re-enchantment of the worlds, the creation of these beautiful spaces and allowing people to explore themselves, I think that it's, for me, I think that it's the next phase of development. Like we were talking a little bit off camera of, this telekinesis and these telepathic experiences and whether or not people can actually affect the world by thinking about it. And I'm not 100% sure about that, But I am 100% sure of the fact that whatever happens next to humans is going to be some massive transformation in the way that we relate to ourselves and to the world. Like, it's an evolutionary step that I can tell that we're going through as this global society, as this the ideas are streaming from all corners of the world, from all cultures, and finally we might actually have the critical mass of people that is required to be able to say, okay, well, can we actually alter our consciousness?
And is there like an institutional approach to that that's not medical? Is like what I would ask, like the next generation of people who are engineering and researching on this. Like, is there a way that we can, as a society, approach these things in an intelligent fashion that isn't just more hospitals? Like, does it have to be a pathological thing? And I think that I don't have the answer to that. But and I'm not. I'm worried about what religion's done in the past, obviously. But I think there's hope there.
I think so too. And the way that I'm currently thinking about it, the first step for me that I want to build towards is building a community platform that gets people to talk about their own experience and how it differs from others, because we don't really do that, not even to our kids oftentimes. Like, people can grow up, oftentimes they become 20 or older before they realize, hey, not being able to visualize things in your mind is not the average experience, right? Not meaning that it's bad or worse, although like the point on paradigm drift that might be related to stone making tools or whatever. That's a good thread to pull on at some point. But like, we never talk about these things, and sometimes even kids have like blurred vision because of some misalignment that we don't recognize because we just assume so much
hearing
about
problems. I had a family member like that. Like, they thought he was doing bad in school, but he just couldn't hear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and oftentimes these things then get diagnosed based on behavior, and then it becomes like ADHD or something else, which sometimes might be true, but sometimes it's also just a sensory thing. But we just assume so much about each other, and we need to get better at communicating across our different ways of perceiving the world, and building a platform where people can provide feedback about like, hey, really, this lighting stresses me out. Does it stress you out as well? And like, trying to figure out how to improve our communication across these phenomenological boundaries is really going to be a key first step to make people aware, hey, there really is a need for things to change. And then we can figure out how to change them. But first we need to figure out, like, okay, like map the sensory space in the community approach. That's sort of what I want to go to next. Yeah.
I love that.
Absolutely. It's hard to navigate without a good map.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot left on the table to talk about. We didn't get to the negative aspects of psychedelics and meditation and everything else, but I think the best
I
conversation...
think we have to come back here next summer.
I think
so.
we do.
Maybe we can do this again.
Sure.
That'd be
And
fantastic.
we should probably give this space back to Joe. And
Yes.
give it-
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for letting us use your incredible space.
Thank you to the Unity Dome in Berlin. If anybody's looking to host a workshop space that is bringing people together, then this seems like a lovely place to be. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, and thank you, man, for everything.
Lovely
You've hosted us here in Berlin, and we got to hang out a little bit, do some climbing, and thank you.
You're very much welcome. I love doing this. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing. Like, it's really brave what you guys are doing, because you're trying to toe the line on the fringes, and really, like, the people are not. It's brave what you're doing, and I really appreciate the whole enterprise of it. Yeah.
I think there's no other way that we could be, unfortunately.
Well.